Imagine a column of Roman soldiers, 20 men perhaps, no more, marching in the grey light of a British dawn. Their cloaks are dark with rain. Their hobnailed boots make a wet, deliberate sound on the chalk path, and the faint smell of iron and oiled leather rises with each step. The valley on either side is soft green, and the fog is pooling low in the folds of the land, so that the men seem to be walking not on earth, but on cloud. And then, as the mist thins, they see it. A hill that is not a hill. A stepped, curving mound of earth, taller than any building they have ever raised in their lives. On either side of the path, tall standing stones rise in silent pairs, some higher than a man, marked with spirals and grooves whose meaning no one alive can read. The avenue stretches ahead of them, straight and old, disappearing gently into the fog. These are the disciplined children of an empire that has swallowed the known world. They have crossed the Alps. They have seen the pyramids at Giza. They have marched under the hard sun of Syria. And here, on a wet morning at the edge of the map, they are looking at something built by hands that had turned to dust 2,000 years before their grandfathers were born. No one built these stones in living memory. No Briton they will meet tonight can quite tell them how it was done. The people who raised them are already a rumor, even to the people who live in their shadow. So here is the quiet question we will carry tonight. What did the Romans see when they looked at Britain? Really see, in the still moments between the marching and the reports? And why did an empire built of stone and law feel in certain valleys oddly small? Tonight we are going to walk slowly through that older island, the one already ancient when the eagles arrived. The stones have waited 5,000 years. They will wait a little longer for us. So find your warm place and let us begin gently at the edge of the fog. If you are watching this to fall asleep, then that is exactly what I make these videos for. Nothing else. So if it helps, you might subscribe quietly. And if you feel like it, leave a small comment below telling me where you are in the world tonight and what time it is where you sit or lie. I always read them. Somebody in Perth, somebody in Ohio, somebody in a small flat in Glasgow at 3 in the morning. It is a quiet comfort to know we are all sharing the same soft dark. And there is no need to keep watching the screen. You can close your eyes now, if they are not already closed. You can let the room go dim around you. My voice will keep going, gently, for a long while, and there is nothing here you need to remember, and nothing you need to catch. If you drift off in the next few minutes, you will miss nothing at all. Sleep is not a failure here. Sleep is the whole point. So let me introduce you, gently, to the man whose small confession sits at the heart of tonight's long walk. His name was Publius Cornelius Tacitus, born around the year 56 of the Common Era, dying somewhere near the year 120, a Roman senator and historian who wrote about this cold northern island from a very great distance. He never came here himself. He assembled Britain out of second-hand reports, out of his father-in-law Agricola's campaign notes, out of merchants' rumors, out of the words of soldiers who had been and returned. He built the island in ink, on a desk, in the south. And in one of those quiet passages he wrote a sentence that has never quite let go of anyone who reads it slowly. Who the original inhabitants of Britain were, he said, whether indigenous or foreign, is, as is usual among barbarians, little known. Little known. A Roman historian, in the fullness of empire, simply setting down that he did not know, and that no one he trusted knew either. To understand what the Romans were looking at, we first have to picture the island itself, long before there was anyone to write about it, long before there were Romans, long before there were Celts, long before there was anything at all that we would recognize as a story. So let us start where almost no history starts. At the very beginning, with the shape of the land, a wide green shape in a grey sea, waiting. I want to begin with the land itself, not with people, not yet. Just the shape of the island, resting in its grey sea, older than any of the stories we will lay upon it. Britain, geologically speaking, is very old. The chalk downs of the south were laid down beneath a warm, shallow sea. More than 70 million years ago, the bones of tiny creatures, settling slowly, layer upon layer, into that soft white stone we still walk over today. The granite spines of Cornwall and Devon, and the mountains of Wales are older still, forged in fire and cooled through unimaginable stretches of time. The peat bogs and heather moors of the north sit on rock that was already ancient when the first fish learned to breathe. This is a very old island, and for most of that immense age it had no name, and no one to name it. For a very long time, the land was simply a wooded, quiet place. After the last great ice sheets began their slow retreat, around 10,000 years ago, small bands of hunter-gatherers moved across it, following red deer through birch forest, gathering hazelnuts in the autumn, camping by rivers, moving on. They lived here for thousands of years. They left almost nothing behind, or rather, they left the kind of things that do not shout. Flint tools shaped by patient hands, the blackened stones of old hearths, worked bones. A thin, patient scatter of humanity across a green and half-drowned country. If you had walked the length of the island in those centuries, you might have gone weeks without meeting another soul, and heard nothing but wind and water, and the calls of birds now vanished from these skies. Then, around the year 4000 before the Common Era, something changed. Farming reached Britain, not as a single dramatic event, not as a sudden arrival, but as a slow wave-like coming, spreading over generations from the continent, carried by families and by ideas together. People began to clear small patches of forest with stone axes. Patient work, years of it, turning wildwood into open ground. They planted grain, they tended cattle and sheep, they built small round houses of timber and turf. And with farming came something the hunter-gatherers had rarely needed: permanence. If you plant a field, you tend to stay near it. If you stay near it, you build. If you build, eventually, you dig ditches, and you raise banks, and in time, you set stones. The first great British monuments are not stone at all, but earth. From around the year 3800 before the Common Era, long barrows begin to appear across the southern chalklands. Low mounds of turf and rubble, some of them the length of a modern city block, covering small stone burial chambers where the bones of a chosen few were placed and rearranged and visited across generations. They are unassuming to look at now, soft green ridges in a rolling field. Easy to miss if you do not know they are there. But they represent something new in the story of these islands, a decision to shape the land itself into a memory. To say, here, in this place, we remember. Here is where our people were laid. Alongside the long barrows come the causewayed enclosures, great rings of banks and ditches cut into hilltops, broken by many entrances, so that the ring is not a wall but a pattern of gaps, a place you could enter from any direction. They are not defensive. No archaeologist believes they were forts. Something else was happening there. Feasts, perhaps. Seasonal gatherings. Exchanges of cattle, of marriage partners, of news. Rituals whose meanings have entirely dissolved. Bones have been found in the ditches, and broken pottery, and the remains of great meals. We do not know what these places were for. Not really. We only know that they mattered enough for tired farming people to spend weeks of their year digging, banking, shaping the ground. Some archaeologists have suggested, and it is only a suggestion, that these early monuments were built not for any single tribe or single family, but by loose networks of farming communities meeting on neutral ground. The land itself, in this soft reading, was becoming a kind of shared cathedral long before anyone had a word for cathedral. A common ground where scattered peoples could recognize one another and find themselves briefly part of something larger. It is speculation. It is offered gently, as one possibility among several. But it is a lovely possibility, and it fits the shape of what these people left behind. Try for a moment to picture it. Dawn over a chalk down in what is now Wiltshire, 6,000 years ago. Cold dew on the short grass, a skylark rising somewhere overhead, invisible against the pale sky, its song falling in fine threads. A mile away, a farmstead sends up a thin blue line of wood smoke that leans slightly in the morning air. The smell around a newly cut ditch is chalk-white and cool, faintly damp, the smell of earth freshly opened. And walking along the top of a new bank, perhaps 20 people barefoot, moving slowly in single file, looking down into the ring they have just made in the ground. No speeches, no trumpets, just the soft sound of feet on turf, and the wind, and the sense of something completed that had not been there before. It is worth pausing to feel how much time we are already talking about. From those first farmers with their long barrows and their circled ditches, to the raising of the great stone circle we will come to next, is 1,000 years. 1,000 years of quiet lives lived on the same fields, of children learning from grandparents, of small changes accumulating almost invisibly. From the raising of that circle to the arrival of Julius Caesar on a Kentish beach is another 2,000 years. And from Caesar to you, listening now in whatever room you are in, is 2,000 more. The whole thing is deeper than any of us can quite hold in the head at once. Try to hold it, and it slips. The mind was not built for these depths. Better to let the numbers wash past like the tide, and simply feel the length of the shore. This is part of why the Romans, when they finally came, felt the strange smallness we spoke of earlier. What did they see when they looked at Britain, and why did an empire of stone and law feel so small in front of it? Some of the answer is here, in this deep, quiet time. The people who built the long barrows had already been at work for 2,000 years, before Rome itself was even founded. The ditches were old before Latin existed. The chalk had already been shaped by human hands into memorials whose original meanings had been forgotten by the locals themselves. An empire that measured itself in centuries was walking into a country that measured itself in the slow accumulation of small green mounds along the horizon. And yet, for all its depth, this first age was a modest age. The tools were of stone and bone. The houses were small. The dead were laid in low chambers under low mounds. The gatherings on the hilltops were seasonal, brief, and then everyone dispersed back to their scattered farms. There was no city. There was no king that we know of. There was no writing to hold a name in place. What there was patience. A patience that could raise the length of a barrow one basketful of chalk at a time. A patience that could cut a ring in the earth over a summer and return year after year to keep it clean. That was the beginning. Just earth and ditches and long low mounds of turf sitting quietly on the downs. Just farms in clearings and hearths in small round houses, and the slow generational work of shaping a land that had known no shaping before. But something in these people was already reaching further, because within a few more centuries, that patience would find a new medium. They would begin to raise stones, enormous stones, stones so large that we still do not entirely understand how they were moved, and one place, on a plain not far from those first long barrows, would take that impulse further than anywhere else in prehistoric Europe. So let us come gently to Stonehenge. Not the postcard Stonehenge, not the ring of weathered stones photographed 1,000,000 times against a bruised English sky. The Stonehenge no one alive has ever really seen. The one still being built. The one that was, for 1,000 years, always half-finished. Always being reconsidered, always being carried forward by hands that never lived to see the next stage. That is the Stonehenge worth walking towards slowly, in the mind, on a night like this. It stands on Salisbury Plain, in the county of Wiltshire, on a broad and gently rolling chalk plateau where the wind moves in long unbroken sweeps, and the sky feels closer to the ground than it does in most places. The plain itself is quiet country. Sheep-cropped grass, low ridges, the pale scars of ancient tracks. You can walk for a long time there and see very little that belongs to our century, if you know where to look and where not to. The thing to understand, and the thing that most surprises people when they hear it, is that Stonehenge was not built all at once. It was not the vision of a single king or a single architect. It was built and rebuilt over roughly 1,000 years, from about 3,000 years before the Common Era to about 2,000 years before it. 100 generations. Each generation adding, moving, rearranging, sometimes even taking things away. The stones you see today are the last long exhalation of a project that outlived every mind that ever worked on it. The first phase, around 3,000 years before the Common Era, was surprisingly modest. A simple circular ditch, and inside it a low bank of chalk thrown up from that ditch. That was all. The word henge comes from just this, an enclosure defined by a ditch and a bank. In the beginning, there were no stones at all, only the ring cut into the turf, white against the green, and whatever the people of that time carried into it in wood, or in ceremony, that has long since vanished from the record. The great stones came later. The Sarsens they are called, and they are a local sandstone, hard and grey, the largest of them standing up to about 7 meters tall and weighing somewhere between 20 and 25 tons each. They were dragged, most probably, from the Marlborough Downs, some 20 miles to the north. 20 miles is not far on a map. 20 miles, with a stone the weight of a small house, over uneven ground, with ropes of twisted hide and rollers of felled timber, is another matter entirely. It is the work of hundreds of people, coordinated over months, fed and housed by a landscape that had to be persuaded to give up that much of its labor. The smaller stones, the blue stones, travelled much further. They came from the Preseli Hills in the far west of Wales, roughly 220 to 240 kilometres from Salisbury Plain. How they were moved is still debated by people who have spent whole careers on the question. Some have suggested they came by sea, floated on rafts or lashed to boats, hugging the Welsh and English coasts, then up the rivers inland. Some have suggested they came overland, on rollers and sledges, hauled across river crossings, and up the long chalk slopes. We do not know for certain. What we know is that they arrived. Stones the weight of small cars, carried somehow across a distance most people in the ancient world would never travel in a lifetime. And once the Sarsens were on site, they were not simply stood upright and left alone. They were shaped with stone hammers, patiently over what must have been years. Their faces were dressed smoother. Their tops were carved with mortise and tenon joins, small stone tongues rising from the uprights to fit into hollows carved in the lintels above them. The curved lintels themselves were fitted end to end with tongue and groove joins, so that the outer ring locked itself together like a stone crown. These are techniques a carpenter would know. They are the techniques of someone who has worked in wood all their life, and then, for reasons we can only guess at, decided that this time the wood would be stone, and the stone would last. The whole structure famously aligns with the sun. On the longest day of the year at midsummer, the sunrise breaks along a specific axis through the stones. On the shortest day, at midwinter, the sun sets along the reverse of that same line. Whoever raised these stones, at whatever cost in muscle and years, wanted the sun to touch them in particular ways on particular days. That much is not in doubt. What that touching meant to them, we can only reach toward. Some have suggested Stonehenge was a temple to the sun, a great open-air cathedral for the turning of the year. Some have suggested it was a place of healing. The blue stones, in medieval legend, were thought to hold curative powers, and though that legend is late by many thousands of years, it may echo something older that the medieval tellers had merely inherited without knowing. Some have suggested it was a place of the dead, a stone counterpart to a wooden gathering place, and that the two together formed a single ceremonial landscape, the living on one side and the ancestors on the other. Some have suggested it was all of these things at once, at different points in its long life. None of these ideas is proven. All of them are gently possible. And around Stonehenge itself, we should remember, lies a much wider ritual landscape that most photographs never show. Burial mounds by the dozen, low green humps on the horizon. Cursus monuments, long parallel banks of earth, running for kilometers across the plain, whose purpose we do not know. And a few miles away the great timber and earth enclosure of Durrington Walls, one of the largest gathering places in Neolithic Europe, where, it seems, thousands of people came together, feasted, and returned home again. Stonehenge did not stand alone. It stood at the heart of a country of monuments, most of them softer, most of them made of wood and earth, most of them long since faded back into the turf. Try for a moment to picture it. The great Sarsens at midwinter dawn, catching the low red light on their eastern faces, while the rest of the plain is still in blue shadow. The pale grass silvered with frost, the breath of gathered people rising in slow white plumes, the stones themselves standing patient and enormous, older than anyone there could quite remember. Or picture the sound of the building itself, the patient, dull tock of a hammerstone shaping a sarsen, going on all day, and then the next day, and then the next, for years. A rhythm that must have been as familiar to the children of the plain as the sound of birdsong or the wind in the grass. Or picture the blue stones in a summer rain, dark and glistening, faintly speckled with the pale flecks that give them their name, water running down their carved faces in thin, bright lines. It is worth sitting with the strangeness of it. These were people with stone tools, with hide ropes, with wooden sledges, with no writing to leave instructions for the next generation. And yet they carried stones from another country, and shaped them like joiners, and set them so precisely that the sun still finds them on the two right days of the year, 4,000 and 5,000 years later. When the Romans finally arrived on this island, Stonehenge was already older to them than the fall of the Roman Empire is to us. It was already a ruin they could not read, already a question no one who lived nearby could quite answer. But Stonehenge, for all its fame, is only one point in a much wider landscape. Not far from it, in another part of the same green county of Wiltshire, another project was rising in the same long centuries. Not a circle this time, not in alignment with the sun, not stones from a distant coast. Something else entirely. A mound. A single vast mound of chalk and earth, rising out of the flat fields like a green hill that should not be there. And no one, even today, quite knows why it was built, or what, if anything, lies waiting at its heart. The mound is called Silbury Hill. It stands beside the modern road in the Kennet Valley in Wiltshire, and if you did not know, you might drive past it and think it was just another green rise in a landscape full of green rises. It is not. It is the largest artificial mound in prehistoric Europe. Every handful of chalk in it was carried there by a person, and set in place by a person, and pressed down by a person, and then covered by the next handful, and the next, until an entire hill stood where no hill had been before. It is not a natural feature of the land. It is a made thing. A thing that was decided upon, and begun, and finished, by human hands, in a century that ended around the year 2400, before the Common Era. That places it, roughly, in the same long stretch of the late Neolithic that saw the great Sarsen phases raised on Salisbury Plain, a little to the south. The people who were shaping the plain of the stones were, in the same generations, shaping this valley of the mound. It rises about 30 to 31 meters above the surrounding meadow, which is to say roughly the height of a modern 10-story building. Its base is about 160 meters across. If you stand at its foot and look up, the slope goes on further than you expect, in soft green steps, until the top cuts a flat, patient line against the sky. The engineering of it is quieter than Stonehenge, and in some ways, stranger. Silbury is built of chalk and earth, layered carefully, and at its heart there is an inner core of stacked turf laid in blocks, as if someone were rebuilding a small piece of the surrounding meadow inside the hill, before burying that meadow beneath everything else. The construction was phased. It was raised, and then enlarged again, over what may have been the better part of a century. The estimates vary, but they suggest something in the order of 1 million cubic feet of material, moved by hand, in baskets, and on shoulders, and in whatever wooden barrows or hide slings those people used. No pulleys. No wheels of the kind that would come later. Only backs, and hands, and time. Over the centuries since, people have wanted very badly to know what was inside. In the 18th century, a shaft was sunk from the top straight down through the layers, in the hope of finding a chamber. In the 19th century, a tunnel was driven in from the side. In the 20th century, another. And in the 21st century, further work went in, not to search this time, but to stabilize the mound, because the older shafts had begun to collapse inward, and the whole hill was, in a slow way, folding into its own old wounds. Each of these investigations was patient and careful and expensive. Each of them was, in its way, a small expedition into the mind of a lost people. And none of them found what everyone half expected to find. No burial chamber, no king in a stone box, no hoard of gold, no temple room at the summit, no sealed door, no inscription, no bones laid out in state. What they found, layer by careful layer, was a beautifully, patiently constructed hill. Chalk on chalk, turf on turf, rubble packed and shaped and packed again. And nothing at the center, or rather, nothing that answered the question. Only the hill itself. That absence is, in its way, the most interesting thing about Silbury, because it forces us to sit with the possibility that the hill is not the container of the meaning. The hill is the meaning. And so, gently, the theories arrive, and none of them can be proven, and all of them are worth holding in the hand for a moment. Some have suggested that Silbury was a great territorial marker, a way of saying, without words, this valley is ours, our people are here, and we have been here long enough to make a mountain. Some have suggested that it was an astronomical platform, aligned in some way with certain stars, or with the movement of the sun on certain days of the year. Some have suggested it was a ceremonial platform, its flat summit used for rites long since lost to us, gatherings we cannot reconstruct. And some have suggested, quite simply, that it was a monument to the making itself. That the point of Silbury was to build Silbury. That the act, taking generations, was the meaning. That the hill was the prayer, and the prayer was in the lifting. Imagine, if you like, the person, whoever they were, who first said, "Here. On this rise, in this bend of the valley, we will make it." Someone who could look at a stretch of pasture and see, in their mind's eye, a hill that did not yet exist. Someone who knew soil and chalk, and the way turf holds its shape when it is cut in blocks and stacked. Someone who could organize other people, and food, and the long tedium of moving earth in baskets from a pit to a rising slope. We do not know their name. We will never know their name. There is no inscription, no story, no folk memory that reaches that far back with any reliability. But someone said, "Here." And here it still is, 4,500 years later, still holding its shape against the rain. Silbury at dawn is one of the quiet sights of England. In the low hours of a still morning, mist pools around its base, so that the mound seems to float, its stepped silhouette blue-grey against a paler sky, and the small streams that ring it make that soft, endless sound of water over chalk. In the moments after rain there is a smell to the place, the smell of wet chalk in the air, cool and faintly mineral, like the smell inside a very old church when you first push the door open, under your feet if you walk close. The grass on its slopes is thin, tough turf, the kind that has been cropped by sheep for 1,000 years, so short and dense it feels almost like moss. And people do walk close, though not on the mound itself. It is protected now, its slopes fenced, the older paths grown over, so that the hill is left to be a hill and not a staircase. There is a small lay-by on the road, and travellers pull in and stand at the fence, and look sometimes for a long time. Some take a photograph and go. Some stay quiet. Some seem, in the way people sometimes do at old sites, to be listening for something they cannot quite name, whatever the Neolithic builders wanted us to feel when we came to their hill. Some faint version of it seems still to reach across the centuries and touch the people who stop by the fence. It is worth remembering that Silbury was not made in isolation. It is one point in a wider ceremonial landscape, tied by paths and sightlines, and old habits of walking to other monuments in the same valley. The people who raised it were not building a single wonder in an empty country. They were adding one more piece to a place that already, in their time, had been a sacred landscape for centuries. The mound looks out across meadows and hedgerows now, but in its own age it looked out across long avenues and gathering places, and other smaller mounds, and beyond them, on the higher ground, a circle of banks and stones so vast it would swallow a modern village whole, because Silbury does not stand alone. A little to the north, in the same green valley, an even larger project was going on at almost the same time. A project that did not raise a hill, but instead took a whole piece of the English landscape and turned it, patiently, over generations, into something like a cathedral without a roof, and without an altar, and without any door but the sky. The place is called Avebury. It is very hard to describe, because unlike Stonehenge, you do not look at Avebury from the outside. You stand inside it. That is the first strange thing about it, and the one that changes how everything else about it feels. You do not approach Avebury the way you approach a cathedral or a castle, walking toward a shape on the horizon. You walk, or you drive, along a small country road, and at some point you notice that the field on your right has become a bank, and the bank has become a ditch, and the ditch is enormous, and there are stones standing in the grass, and you realize, quietly, that you are already inside the monument, and have been for some minutes without knowing it. Avebury is one of the largest prehistoric stone circles in Europe. It was constructed between roughly 2,600–2,400 years before the Common Era, which places its building a few centuries before Silbury Hill was raised only a mile away. The great outer earthwork, what archaeologists call a henge, encloses a circle roughly 347 meters across. That is more than a fifth of a mile from side to side. It is large enough that a small English village sits comfortably inside it now, with lanes and cottages and a pub and a church, all of them tucked within the ancient bank, as if inside the rim of a bowl. The ditch, when it was freshly cut, was up to 9 or 10 meters deep, dug down into the white chalk beneath the turf. The bank piled up from that ditch rose higher still. To stand inside Avebury, in the Neolithic, would have been to stand at the bottom of a bright white bowl, the chalk shining in the sun, the horizon walled off, the sky pressed suddenly closer. Today the ditch has softened, filled with a slow accumulation of centuries, and the bank is green with grass. But the shape is still there. You can walk the top of the bank and look down into the enclosure, and the geometry of it is still, even now, quietly astonishing. Within the great henge stood an outer ring of massive standing stones, perhaps 100 of them originally, with 2 smaller stone circles set inside the larger one. Not all of them survive. Many of the stones are gone now. Some were toppled or broken up in the medieval and early modern periods, when Avebury became a working village, and its ancient stones came to be seen as inconvenient, or worse, as unchristian. There are stories of stones being buried by nervous villagers in the 14th century, and stones being cracked apart with fire and water in the 17th and 18th centuries, so their pieces could be built into walls and cottages. Some of the survivors have been carefully re-erected in the last 100 years, their positions found again by the pale marks their bases had left in the chalk. From the southern edge of the henge, a great avenue of paired standing stones once ran for about 2.5 kilometers. It is called the West Kennet Avenue, and it led from Avebury down through the fields toward another, smaller stone site known as the Sanctuary. The stones were set in pairs, one on the left of the walker, one on the right, marching in a slow curve across the downland. Some of them are tall and thin, almost like slender human figures. Some are broad and square, more like patient shoulders. Their surfaces are pale grey, mottled with lichen in soft greens and dusty yellows, and in early morning, when the mist is still low in the fields, they look like 2 long rows of sentries who have grown roots. Nearby, on a low ridge above the valley, stands the West Kennet Long Barrow. It is a chambered tomb from around 3,600 years before the Common Era, older than Avebury itself, older even than most of the stones you can see. Its stone-lined passages still admit a visitor to walk in, bent a little at the shoulders, and stand where bones were laid down 5,500 years ago. Inside, it is cool and still and faintly damp, and the sound of your own breathing becomes suddenly clear against the old stone, as if the barrow were listening back. And Silbury sits within a mile of all this, quietly holding its own end of the valley. Stonehenge is only 25 miles to the south. The whole region, a stretch of chalk downland no larger than a single English county, held one of the densest ritual landscapes anywhere in the ancient world. It is not that these monuments are near each other by accident. They belong to one another. They were made by communities who saw the valley as a single sacred country, and who spent generations tying its high points and its low points, together with banks and stones and avenues and mounds. Some have suggested that Avebury and the West Kennet Avenue were meant to be walked, that the movement itself, in pairs or in procession between the standing stones, was part of the point. Some have suggested that the geometry of henge, avenue, mound and barrow was a way of writing the shape of a cosmology onto the land itself, a text that could only be read by walking through it. We do not know. The people who built it left no words, but it is worth saying, softly, that when you stand at Avebury and look south, toward the low green cone of Silbury Hill on the horizon, you are looking along a line of sight the builders certainly considered. You can walk it now, if you choose, on a quiet afternoon. You can pass out of the southern entrance of the henge and follow the surviving stones of the avenue down through the meadows, one pair after another, and feel how the land dips and rises under your feet, and how each pair of stones frames the next, and how, without ever quite meaning to, you begin to walk in the slow, deliberate rhythm of a procession that ended 4,500 years ago. In the evenings, Avebury is one of the strangest villages in England to see at dusk. Lamps come on in cottage windows. Someone walks a dog along a lane, and the great stones stand between the houses, like patient neighbours who have been there considerably longer than the houses have, and who will, in all probability, be there considerably longer still. The village has grown up inside the monument the way lichen grows on the stones, quietly, incidentally, without ever quite disturbing the older shape underneath. There is nothing in the written record of the people who built Avebury. No name for the henge, no name for the avenue, no name even for themselves. They left the ditch and the bank and the stones, and the alignments, and the tombs, and then, over the course of a few centuries, they left the stage, because something happened around the middle of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era that we are only just beginning to understand. The great age of henge and mound and avenue, of chalk-cut circles and long stone processions, did not simply continue on into later British history. It faded. It was replaced. The hands that raised Avebury were not in the end the hands of the people who would meet the Romans 2,500 years later. The people who raised Avebury and Silbury and Stonehenge were not in any simple sense the ancestors of every later Briton. Something happened around the middle of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era that we are only just beginning to understand. Something that the bones themselves, sleeping in barrows and river gravels, have quietly begun to tell us in the last few years, once we learned how to ask them. It is one of the strangest and quietest turnings in the whole long story of this island, and it comes with a new kind of pot, and a new kind of grave, and a new kind of people walking up the beaches from the sea. And that is where the valley of Avebury, with its white ditches softening into green, and its long avenue of paired stones fading into the meadows, hands its story on. There is a phrase archaeologists sometimes use, the bell beaker phenomenon, and if you have not heard it before, that is quite all right. It is not a household name. It does not appear on the road signs beside the great stone circles. It is simply the working label agreed among specialists for one of the quietest and most consequential turnings in the whole long story of these islands. It is the name for a moment, spread across a few centuries, when the population of Britain, and much of its material world with it, quietly changed. The moment did not announce itself. There was no single day, no battle in the chronicles, no scorched horizon. It came in on the tide, and up the river valleys, and into the houses, one generation at a time, until the island that emerged on the other side was not in any simple sense the same island that had gone in. The name comes from a pot, a very particular kind of pot, small, bell-shaped, with a gently flaring rim and a curved profile that narrows toward the base, standing perhaps as high as a hand is long. The clay tends toward a warm reddish-brown, and the surface is often finely decorated with horizontal bands of incised patterns, tiny impressed lines and dotted rows, arranged in careful zones around the body of the cup. They are drinking vessels, in all likelihood, and they are strikingly consistent in shape across enormous distances. A beaker made in what is now Portugal, and a beaker made in what is now the Netherlands, and a beaker made in what is now Wiltshire, share a family resemblance that is impossible to miss when they are set side by side on a museum shelf. That style of pottery first appears in Iberia and in Central Europe around 2800 before the Common Era, and then spreads across much of the continent over the following centuries, carried along the coasts and up the rivers and across the mountain passes. Then, in the window between roughly 2500–2200 before the Common Era, bell beaker-associated communities begin arriving in Britain. They arrived during the very centuries in which Silbury was being finished, and Avebury completed, and the Sarsen Circle at Stonehenge already stood in something close to the form we know. They walk up the beaches, in ones and twos and small family groups, and they begin to settle. For a long time, archaeologists debated whether the beaker phenomenon was a movement of people or a movement of ideas, or something in between. A fashion, perhaps, for a particular kind of cup and a particular way of burying the dead, spreading from community to community without any great migration. That debate looked one way in the 20th century. It looks rather different now. In 2018, a major ancient DNA study published in the journal Nature examined the genomes of hundreds of ancient skeletons from across Britain and Europe. Its finding in Britain was startling. Within a few centuries of the bell beaker arrival, up to about 90% of the previous Neolithic genetic ancestry of the island had been replaced. 9/10. The people who had raised the long barrows, who had dug the ditch at Avebury with antler picks, who had hauled the bluestones out of the Preseli Hills, do not, in the main, seem to have been the direct genetic ancestors of the Britons who lived on the island 1,000 years later. This does not necessarily mean violence. The bones do not tell that story. It might mean that the newcomers brought new diseases to which the older population had no immunity, and that a slow, invisible attrition did most of the work. It might mean that they simply out-reproduced the earlier communities, whose numbers may already have been declining for reasons we do not yet understand. It might mean a slow displacement, a marrying in and a marrying out, over 10 or 15 generations, until the older ancestry thinned in the blood like a color fading from cloth. It might mean all of these things at once, in different valleys, at different speeds. The record is quiet. The record does not shout. What we can say is that the culture changed. Individual burials, often furnished with distinctive grave goods, begin to replace the older communal tomb traditions. Where once the dead had been gathered together in long-chambered mounds, mingled bone with bone in the dark, now a single body is laid in a single grave, curled on its side, with its own small treasures beside it. A beaker, of course, placed near the head or the hand. A copper dagger, sometimes, corroded green now, lying on a rectangle of dark cloth in a museum case. Beside a set of small flint arrowheads, an archer's wrist guard of polished stone, the burial kit of someone who died 4,000 years ago, and was thought worth remembering as an individual. These newcomers also brought, almost certainly, early metalworking, copper first, drawn from ores in Ireland and in the west of Britain, and then, before very long, tin-alloyed copper, which is to say bronze, harder and more useful than either metal alone. Metal begins to appear in significant quantities in British finds from this period onward, not yet common, not yet in every household, but present, glinting in the graves, sharpening the edges of the world. And they may have brought, though here we must move gently, the first Indo-European languages ever spoken on the island. The language family that would eventually give rise to Celtic and to Welsh, and to a great deal else across Europe, may have arrived in Britain around this time, carried in the mouths of beaker communities. This is debated among linguists and archaeologists, and it is offered here as one possibility among several. The evidence hints at it. The evidence does not prove it. It is the sort of question that may never be entirely closed. Some have suggested that the arrival of the bell beaker people is the true rupture in British prehistory, that the world of Stonehenge and Silbury and Avebury, the world of the long barrows and the great chalk enclosures, was in a real sense the world of a different people. The builders of the great monuments do not seem to be the direct genetic ancestors of the Bronze and Iron Age Britons the Romans would eventually meet. If that reading is right, and it may be, then the Romans, when they came ashore in the 1st century, were looking at monuments raised by a vanished population. Not merely very old, belonging to someone else entirely. Older to the Britons who welcomed or resisted the legions than the legions themselves are to us. Picture, for a moment, a small bell beaker cup being unearthed from a modern excavation, held in gloved hands under a work lamp. The reddish-brown clay incised with tiny horizontal grooves that a thumbnail pressed into wet clay 4,000 years ago. Picture a copper dagger laid out beside it, its blade dulled to green, its wooden handle long returned to the soil. And picture, if you like, an imagined moment somewhere in a chalk valley in the middle of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, the last person born in that valley to speak the language of the henge builders, dying peacefully in old age, with grandchildren around them who no longer knew the old words, only a few strange names for hills and rivers, worn smooth in the mouth like pebbles. The old ways did not vanish overnight. The monuments were not torn down. There is no evidence of any deliberate campaign against the older sacred places. In many places, the new people simply used them, reused them, walked past them, buried their own dead in single graves near them, added their small round barrows to the shoulders of the older long ones. Stonehenge continued to stand. Silbury continued to rise from its meadow. The Avebury Circle held its ground, and the avenue kept its slow curve, and the villages that grew up nearby went on drawing water from the same springs. But the hands that tended these places were, gradually, different hands. The songs sung on the ridgeways were gradually different songs. And in the centuries that followed, this newer population began the long, slow business of turning Britain into a Bronze Age country. A country of metal and trade and family-sized graves, of tin from the far southwestern peninsulas, and of ships nosing carefully along the coasts, with cargoes of ingots and amber and worked bronze. For a very long time, roughly from 2,500 years before the Common Era down to about 800 before the Common Era, which is a stretch longer than the whole of recorded English history, Britain was a Bronze Age country. And though the monument building did not stop entirely, the shape of daily life quietly changed. The great communal projects grew fewer. The energy of the island turned, slowly, towards smaller circles. The family, the field, the forge. The boat drawn up on a beach at dusk. The old stones still stood on their ridges, weathered a little more each winter, and people still walked past them with a kind of inherited reverence. But the center of gravity of ordinary life was migrating, softly, away from the henges, and toward the hearth. To understand the change, it helps to remember what bronze actually is. Bronze is an alloy, usually about 90% copper, and roughly 10% tin. To make it, you need both metals, and in the ancient world, tin was rare. Copper turned up in many places across Europe and the Near East, in green-veined outcrops that could be smelted with sufficient patience and heat. But tin was elusive. Whole regions of the ancient world had no source of it at all, and had to import it from somewhere far away, over routes that were sometimes little more than rumor. Britain had tin. It had a great deal of it, in fact, in the far southwest, in Cornwall and in Devon, in the veins of granite that run under those long wet peninsulas out toward the Atlantic. Streams cutting down through the moors washed grains of the ore into their gravel beds, where it could be gathered without deep mining, panned like gold from the cold water. Cornish tin, alloyed with copper from Ireland, from Wales, and from the continent, seems to have supplied bronze-making across much of Western Europe for centuries. The metal that armed and adorned distant kingdoms was in part born from the wet granite of an island most of those kingdoms had never seen. There is scattered, but real evidence that this tin travelled remarkably far. Some scholars have argued that Cornish tin reached the eastern Mediterranean in the 2nd millennium before the Common Era, feeding the workshops of civilizations, whose names the Britons could not have known. The details of these routes remain debated, and it is honest to say that we do not know the exact hands through which each ingot passed, but the direction of the current is clear enough. Something small and grey and heavy left the beaches of the southwest, and something of its influence reached almost impossibly distant shores. Ships in this period would have been modest craft, hide-covered frames stretched over willow ribs, or hollowed logs, or later, planked vessels sewn together with cord and caulked with moss and pitch. Voyages hugged coasts. Trade went in slow, patient hops from beach to beach, an ingot changing hands 3 or 4 times before it reached its final forge. A journey that a modern cargo ship completes in an afternoon might have taken a whole summer, timed to fair weather and known landfalls, guided by the shapes of headlands and the memory of older sailors. Picture, if you like, a Cornish coast in the late afternoon. Seagulls circling above dark granite, the smell of salt and drying seaweed. Small boats being drawn up on shingle beaches by men whose language is completely unknown to us, whose names are not written down anywhere. A basket of ingots handed across, a nod exchanged, a meal shared by a driftwood fire, while the tide slid back. This was not the drama of empire, it was the quiet economics of a metal age, conducted in a dozen accents no one now can hear. Inland, the Bronze Age Britons continued to build, though on a gentler scale. Round barrows, smaller individual burial mounds, replaced the great long barrows of the earlier era. Thousands of them still dot the British landscape, particularly on the chalk downs of the south, low green hummocks that a walker can miss entirely unless the light is right. Each one holds, or once held, a single person or a small family, sometimes with a beaker at their side, a bronze pin, a necklace of jet or amber. The dead were no longer gathered into vast communal chambers. They were becoming individuals again, each with their own small hill. Fields, too, become visible in this age. From about 1500 before the Common Era onward, the landscape of southern Britain is increasingly divided by low banks and ditches. The first field systems laying out organized agriculture on a scale that had not been seen before. On aerial photographs, in the slanting light of early morning, whole patchworks of these ancient boundaries can still be traced beneath modern pasture, faint rectangles ghosting through the grass. Somebody, 3,500 years ago, decided where the wheat would end and the barley would begin, and marked it with a bank of earth that has, quietly, outlasted every empire since. On hilltops, early defensive enclosures begin to appear. Not yet the great hill forts we will come to in a little while, but their ancestors. Small ramparted sites, some occupied briefly, some for generations, ringed by a single ditch and a low wall of earth and timber. They speak of a world in which communities had begun to feel the need to gather, to watch, and sometimes to defend. Life was not one long idyll. There were bad years, raids, quarrels over cattle and grazing, but the ramparts were modest, and often the sites within them looked more like meeting places than fortresses. Some have suggested that Britain, by the Middle Bronze Age, was already part of a European trading network in which its tin was strategically important. A metal-producing island, small on the map, but essential to the machines of war and craft on the continent. If that reading is right, and it is a hedged reading, not a certainty, then the Romans, when they came, were not entering a forgotten backwater. They were entering a country that had, for 1,000 years, been quietly essential to the metallurgy of half of Europe. The Romans would inherit a landscape shaped by these long-forgotten centuries, and by hands whose names no writer ever recorded. Think of the objects that survive from those years. A small bronze axe head, its cutting edge worn from use, its surface a soft, dark, greenish-brown, lying in the palm of a modern archaeologist under a museum lamp. A pin with a spiral head, a bracelet of twisted wire, a spearhead whose socket still holds a fragment of ashwood. These were not luxuries only. They were the practical furniture of a society that had learned to shape metal to almost every purpose. Cooking, cutting, hunting, adornment, gift-giving, burial. Bronze wove itself into daily life, the way iron would later, and plastic later still. And out in the fields, and above them, the older monuments still stood. A round barrow in the middle of a wheat field, unploughed, still marking one person's grave, 3,500 years after their burial. A great henge on the horizon, no longer the center of communal ceremony perhaps, but still respected, still walked around rather than through, still spoken of in stories whose exact words we cannot recover. The Bronze Age did not erase what came before. It settled around it, the way a river settles around an old stone, wearing it slowly smoother, without ever quite dislodging it. For close to 2,000 years, this way of living held. Generations were born, worked their fields, cast their bronze, buried their dead beneath low green mounds, and passed on. The rhythm was so long and so steady that it can be hard, from our short vantage, to feel its weight. If you stood at any moment inside those centuries, the world around you would have seemed almost unchanging. The same crops, the same tools refined slightly, the same beliefs slowly evolving, the same salt smell along the same beaches, where the same small boats came in with their same heavy baskets. But bronze, for all its beauty and all its usefulness, is soft. It bends, it dulls. A bronze sword, struck hard against another, will curl at the edge, and a bronze plough will wear before its season is out. And around 800, before the Common Era, or somewhere in that long century, a new metal began to arrive in Britain. One that could be worked in ways bronze could not. And with it, the shape of British society and the shape of the land itself began once more to change. The Iron Age. That is the phrase we use. And it is a slightly misleading phrase, because iron did not replace bronze all at once, and much of daily life stayed very nearly the same for a very long time. The same fields were worked. The same low green mounds still marked the ancestors. The same small boats still came in along the same shingle beaches. But the arrival of iron did something quiet and important to the landscape, and to the people moving across it, and to the way they thought about power and about home. Iron technology reached Britain in a slow drift, arriving round 800 to 700 before the Common Era, carried across the continent from Central Europe over generations rather than years. It did not sweep in on the tide. It seeped, the way rain seeps into chalk, unhurried and thorough. And the reason it mattered was not that iron was somehow nobler than bronze, but that iron was, in a plain and practical sense, everywhere. Bronze had needed tin from Cornwall and Devon, and copper from further afield, and the long trade routes that carried them. Iron ore, by contrast, could be found in bog and hillside across much of the island. Once the technique of smelting and forging was understood, iron tools and weapons could be made in many more places, by many more people, from materials close at hand. That single fact reshaped the shape of who could make what. A village with a smith and a bloomery furnace was no longer waiting on a distant convoy. It could produce its own ploughshares, its own knives, its own spear points, its own nails. Iron blunted less easily than bronze. An iron axe could bite into a harder wood and stay sharp longer. An iron ploughshare could turn heavier soils that bronze had struggled with, and so land that had been marginal became worth clearing, and clearings widened, and the pattern of fields on the island slowly thickened. By around 500, before the Common Era, most of what is now England and Wales was inhabited by peoples speaking Celtic languages, the linguistic ancestors of modern Welsh and Cornish, and cousins of the Gaulish tongues across the Channel. This did not happen because a great new army invaded and displaced the old population. The genetic evidence suggests something quieter than that. The language and the cultural currents of Iron Age Europe reached the island and over generations reshaped the older population already here, until the tongues spoken around a hearth in Kent would have been mutually understandable, more or less, to a trader from Gaul. And it is in these centuries that the most visible signature of Iron Age Britain rises across the countryside. The hill fort, thousands of them, scattered across the whole island, from the chalk downs of the south to the moors of the north. Some are small, no more than a single ring of bank and ditch around a hilltop. Others are enormous, layered, deliberate, monumental in their own right. The largest and most famous is Maiden Castle in Dorset. It covers roughly 47 acres, one of the greatest Iron Age hill forts in all of Europe. Its ramparts climb a long, steep hill in 3 and sometimes 4 great earthen waves, with deep ditches carved between them, and complicated in-turned entrances that force any attacker to slow, to twist, to be seen from above. Standing on those ramparts today, with the wind moving through the grass and sheep grazing quietly along the slopes. You can still read the shape of it, still see how the chalk once glowed white and raw when the banks were freshly cut, wrapping the whole hill in pale layered waves. Others rise in the same way across the country. Danebury in Hampshire, densely occupied for centuries, with row upon row of storage pits sunk into its interior. Old Oswestry, in Shropshire, its earthworks so elegant they look almost sculpted. Cadbury Castle, in Somerset, later folded into the Arthurian legends of a much later age. Some of these places seem to have been mainly refuges, used in troubled seasons and otherwise quiet. Others were, in every meaningful sense, small towns. Permanently lived in, densely built, full of roundhouses, granaries raised on posts to keep grain dry, storage pits, craft workshops, the low continuous smoke of many hearths. And that word, roundhouse, is worth pausing on, because it is the shape of home for most of Iron Age Britain. Circular in plan, built of timber posts set upright in a ring, with wattle and daub walls woven and smeared between them, and a tall conical roof of thatch rising to a peak. Inside, a single central hearth, a smoke hole above, storage jars along the walls, sleeping places at the edges. The floor was packed earth, worn smooth by many feet. Step inside one, in imagination, and it becomes hard to see it as anything less than a solved problem. The air is dim and warm. The sweet, dry smell of wood smoke mixes with the scent of herbs hanging in bundles from the roof beams. A soft golden light falls from the smoke hole in a slow circle onto the packed earth. Rain drums on the thatch above, and does not come through. Wind moves around the curved wall and finds no flat face to press against. These houses shed weather with a quiet, refined efficiency, and they held heat, and they were extremely well suited to the British climate. The Romans, when they came, whose own houses were rectangular and built of stone, would see the roundhouse as primitive. In truth, it was a very old and very refined answer to a very particular question, asked by a place that rains often and blows hard from the west. In the last few centuries before the Common Era, particularly in the south and east of the island, something new began to appear alongside the hill forts. A different kind of settlement, larger, flatter, more sprawling, less obviously defended. The Romans, when they later described such places, used a Latin word for them, oppida. The word simply means towns. Camulodunum, at what is now Colchester in Essex, was one. Verlamion, near what is now St. Albans in Hertfordshire, was another. There were others besides, tucked among the river valleys of the southeast. They had streets, and quarters given over to particular crafts, and mints producing their own coinage in gold and silver, stamped with abstract designs and the names of local rulers. They had elite compounds set apart from the working districts. They had markets. Imagine, one on a busy day, the clean ringing of a smith's hammer carrying across the ground, the smell of roasting meat drifting from a cooking pit, the soft crunch of iron-shod cartwheels on packed earth streets, coins passing hand to hand for a length of woven cloth, for a bronze brooch, for a jar of imported wine from Gaul. Some scholars have suggested that by the 1st century before the Common Era, Britain was already well on its way to becoming, in its own way, an urbanized society. Not by the Mediterranean pattern, not built of stone and marble and colonnaded forums, but built of timber and thatch and layered earthwork. And no less complex for that, it is possible in this reading that the Roman conquest, when it came, did not so much bring civilization to Britain as overwrite one civilization with another, one whose surviving texts and stone roads would speak loudly, on top of one whose language and timber towns would fall silent and rot back into the soil. This was the Britain the Romans would meet, and it was not, we may fairly guess, what they expected, not a wilderness of painted savages beyond the last edge of the world. A patchwork of tribes with kings and queens, mints and markets, warriors with iron swords and shields painted in bright patterns, farmers working long cleared fields, and hilltops layered with generations of engineering in chalk and earth. A place already dense with its own history. And within these settlements, and above them, and beside them at the edges of the sacred groves and the still, dark pools moved a group of people whom the Romans would come to fear more than any warrior on any rampart. Not for their swords, for what they knew, and for what they refused to commit to writing, and for the quiet authority they carried into every hall and every clearing where they were welcome. The Druids. Everyone has heard of them, and almost no one knows very much about them, because they left, quite deliberately, no writings of their own. What we have, instead, is the shape of them glimpsed through other people's words, and through the quiet things they placed into water and left behind in the earth. The rest is silence, and it is a silence they chose. They were, so far as we can piece it together, a class of religious specialists in Iron Age Celtic society. Priests, yes, but also teachers, judges, keepers of law and lore, memorizers of genealogies, tellers of stories, arbitrators of disputes. They stood outside the ordinary run of village life, and moved through it with a different kind of authority. They were described in various Greek and Roman sources, most famously in the accounts of Julius Caesar concerning Gaul, and it is largely through the eyes of outsiders, and often hostile outsiders, that we know them at all. Caesar reports that Druidic training could take up to 20 years. 20 years of learning, and in all that time, nothing was written down. Everything, the laws, the poems, the star lore, the histories of tribes and the pedigrees of kings, everything was learned by heart. And this, according to Caesar, was deliberate. It was a way of keeping sacred knowledge from being casually copied by those who had not earned it. And it was a way, too, of exercising the memory, of making the mind itself the library. Imagine that, a whole civilization's inheritance, carried not on parchment, but in the living breath of a person who had spent 2 decades filling themselves with it. They seem also to have moved across tribal boundaries in a way that ordinary people simply could not. Where a warrior from one tribe might be killed on sight upon crossing into the lands of another, a druid could pass through. They could travel between warring peoples. They could arbitrate. They could refuse to take sides. In a landscape carved up into the territories of the Iceni and the Trinovantes, the Catuvaloni and the Brigantes and the Silures, this was no small thing. It made them, in a sense, the connective tissue of the island, quietly walking the paths between the oppida of the previous chapter's roundhouses and markets, welcomed at each hearth, expected at each rite. Roman and Greek sources associate them with particular sacred places, groves of oak trees above all, and sacred waters, rivers and lakes, springs and bogs and small dark pools tucked into the folds of the land. And here the archaeology of Iron Age Britain speaks, in its own quiet and physical way, with a voice that agrees with the written sources. Across the country, in rivers and marshes and peat, archaeologists have found ritual deposits, objects that were not lost, objects that were placed, fine bronze and iron swords, some of them bent double before they were cast in, folded almost in half by human strength so that they could never be used again. Torques, those heavy, twisted neck rings of gold and electrum and bronze that marked the Iron Age elite, dropped into peat where no one was ever meant to retrieve them. Shields, helmets, cauldrons, whole hoards of beautiful, painstakingly wrought metalwork, worth years of a craftsman's labor, given willingly to the water. Among the most famous of these, finds are 2 pieces dredged from the Thames, the Battersea shield, its bronze face worked in flowing curvilinear patterns, and set with small studs of red glass, a masterpiece of what is sometimes called Celtic art. And the Waterloo helmet, also from the Thames, a bronze cap with 2 curving horns rising from its crown, its horns still intact after more than 2,000 years underwater. Both are extraordinary works of craft. Both were, so far as anyone can tell, placed into the river on purpose. Not lost in battle, not fallen from a boat, given. In some sacred waters, human remains have been found as well. Sometimes the context is clearly ritual, sometimes ambiguous, and it is not always possible to tell whether a body reached its resting place through ceremony, or through misfortune, or through some quieter and older custom that would not fit neatly into either word. But it is fair to say that in Iron Age Britain, Water seems to have been understood as a place where the boundary between worlds became thin. Something you gave to the water was, perhaps, not truly gone, but passed on elsewhere. So picture, if you like, the composite figure who stands at the center of all this. A person in a heavy woolen cloak, damp with the mist of a morning that has not yet decided to become day. They are walking at the edge of a small pool in a wooded hollow, somewhere in the interior of the island. In their hands is a sword. A good sword, patterned along the blade from the folding of the iron. The hilt bound with fine bronze wire, a weapon that took a smith many days to make. They stop at the water. They speak words that will never be written down, and that no one alive today can any longer reconstruct. They bend the blade with their own strength, or with the help of another, until it is nearly folded in half, and then they slide it, gently, into the black water. There is a soft plunk, and that is all. The ripples widen and settle. The mist moves. The reeds at the edge of the pool are very still. Somewhere in the woodland, a wood pigeon calls, and then falls quiet again. And the sword, that hard-won, patient piece of human craft, is simply gone. Down into the dark, where it will lie undisturbed for 2,000 years, waiting for a farmer's dredge, or an archaeologist's trowel, or the slow drying of a bog, to bring it up again into a world that will no longer know quite what to make of it. Some have suggested that Druidic knowledge preserved fragments of much older traditions, that when Roman eyes looked on the Druids of Britain, they may have been seeing not only a priesthood of their own age, but the last living echo of a wisdom already ancient, when Rome itself was young, carried in unbroken memory back through the Iron Age, and perhaps further still, into the world of the long avenues and the great mounds and the stone circles that had by then stood in the landscape for 2,000 years. Whether any of this is true, we may never know. The Druids kept their promise. They wrote nothing down. Roman writers, for their part, were unnerved by them, whether from genuine fear, or from political calculation, or from some mixture of the two that even they might not have been able to name. Rome eventually singled the Druids out for suppression, in a way it rarely did with any other conquered religion. The empire that was usually content to absorb and rename the gods of the peoples, it defeated, made an exception here. Something about this priesthood, and the authority it carried, and the quiet island network it seemed to hold together, was judged too dangerous to leave in place. You can, if you visit the British Museum today, stand before the Battersea Shield under its soft museum lights. The bronze has gone a gentle green with age. The swirls still catch the light. The small red glass studs still glow, faintly, as they were meant to glow across a firelit hall in the century before Christ was born. It is hard, standing in front of it, not to feel the weight of the choice that put it into the river. Someone made that shield. Someone else, or perhaps the same someone, decided that it belonged to the water more than it belonged to any warrior. And it is easy, too, to picture the small pool in the wooded hollow, no bigger than a room, its surface unbroken, reeds around its edge, mist drifting across it in the grey hour before sunrise. The sound, imagined, of a heavy iron blade sliding beneath still water, a very small sound in a very quiet place, and a figure turning and walking back into the trees, and the pool closing over what has been given, as pools do. This was the deep texture of the island beneath its hill forts and its markets and its coined kings, a landscape braided together by unwritten law, by memorized poetry, by sacred groves and sacred waters, by a priesthood that walked between tribes and asked the rivers to keep its secrets. And it was into this world, the world of hill forts and oppida, of long roads through wooded hills, and of druids walking to sacred pools before dawn, that Roman ships first appeared, one late summer morning, on the Channel horizon. The Romans came twice, in a sense, once briefly and once for good. That is the shape of it, when you stand back far enough to see. A first arrival that touched the shore and withdrew, and a second, decades later, that stayed, and settled, and built roads, and never quite finished asking itself what it had walked into. Julius Caesar, born in the year 100 before the Common Era, was in the middle of his long conquest of Gaul when he first looked north across the water. That war ran from 58 to 50 in the years before Christ. A decade of marches and sieges and careful dispatches sent home to Rome. And somewhere in the middle of it, in 55, Caesar decided to cross the Channel. His stated reasons were military. The Britons, he wrote, had been sending aid to their kinsmen in Gaul, and this had to be answered. His deeper reasons, some have suggested, were closer to reputation than to strategy. Britain was, to a Roman audience, the edge of the world. To touch it was to be seen touching it. That first expedition was small and largely a reconnaissance. He landed on the Kent coast, met determined resistance almost from the moment his ships grounded on the shingle, and after a difficult few weeks in which storms damaged his fleet and the local tribes proved less amenable than he had hoped, he withdrew. The following year, in 54 before the Common Era, he returned with a larger force. This time he pushed inland. He crossed the Thames. He engaged with the war chariots of the Britons, like two-horse machines driven at speed along the flanks of an advancing line, warriors leaping down to fight on foot and springing back up to be carried away again. The Romans had not seen chariots used in warfare in Gaul, and they described them with a mixture of admiration and unease. Caesar exacted tribute promises before winter drove him back to the continent. In practice, those promises were not kept. And then Britain for nearly 100 years sat on the edge of Roman awareness, traded with, written about, occasionally threatened, not conquered. Ships came and went across the Channel with tin and hides and hunting dogs. And Roman merchants learned the names of southern kings, and Roman geographers drew the island in shapes that were sometimes accurate and sometimes strange. But no legion crossed for a century. Then, in the year 43 of the Common Era, the Emperor Claudius, born in 10 before the Common Era, ordered the invasion in earnest. Claudius was, by Roman standards, a scholarly and cautious ruler, a man who had spent his younger years writing histories and being underestimated by his relatives. He had come to the throne in circumstances that left him needing, urgently, a military triumph to secure his position. Britain, mythical and distant, half legend and half rumor, offered him one. 4 legions crossed the Channel under the general Aulus Plautius. They landed, most likely, at Richborough in Kent, on a shore where the outlines of their supply base can still be traced in the ground, and they began to push inland. Claudius himself came over later, briefly, to be present when Camulodunum, the great oppidum of the southeast, that we now call Colchester, was formally taken. He stayed 16 days, some sources say, and returned to Rome to celebrate his triumph. The soldiers stayed rather longer. The conquest was not swift, and it was not easy. It took decades. Hill forts had to be taken, one by one, along the slow line of the Roman advance. Maiden Castle itself was assaulted early in the campaign, its concentric ramparts stormed by a Roman force under the future Emperor Vespasian. And in modern times the graves of some of its defenders have been excavated on that slope, a few of them with Roman ballista bolts still lodged in their spines. It is a quiet detail from a loud day. The bones lay there, in the chalk, for nearly 2,000 years, holding on to the shape of one afternoon. The Romans encountered war chariots and iron swords. They encountered chainmail, the mail armor they called the lorica hamata, whose invention is often credited to Celtic smiths, and which the Romans themselves eventually adopted, refined, and standardized across their legions. It is one of the small ironies of the conquest that some of the equipment worn by imperial soldiers, generations later, traced its origin to the workshops of the peoples they had come to subdue. They encountered the roundhouses of the countryside, timber-framed, thatched, half-warm, and they thought them primitive. They encountered the oppida, the sprawling prototowns of the southern tribes, at Camulodunum and at Verlamion near what is now St. Albans, and they did not quite know what to call them, not cities by their measure, not villages either, something in between, with earthworks and workshops and mints and a life that did not fit their categories. They encountered the hill forts and set about methodically, either storming them or making them irrelevant by building neat Roman towns on the flat ground nearby, drawing the trade and the taxes down off the heights. And they encountered the Druids. In the year 60, or perhaps 61 of the Common Era, a Roman army under the governor Suetonius Paulinus marched to the northwestern coast of Wales and crossed the strait onto the island of Mona, which we now call Anglesey, one of the great Druidic centres in Britain. What followed was described later, in Roman prose, as the destruction of the sacred groves. The trees were cut, the altars were broken, the priesthood that had walked between tribes and asked the rivers to keep its secrets lost its heartland in a single campaign season. And what did they see in the days between marches? Some have suggested that in the pauses of their conquest, in the wet mornings, on the chalk paths, in the valleys full of mist, the Romans saw more than they wrote down. They passed by mounds already 2,000 years old, mounds that had been ancient before Rome itself was founded. They walked between standing stones, whose alignments they did not read. They forded rivers into which, invisible to them, ancient swords still lay in the silt, given long ago by hands whose names no one remembered. Whether they felt awe, or discomfort, or simple wariness, we cannot say for certain. But the sense of being small in an old country is something soldiers of every age have felt, and it would be strange if the Romans alone had felt nothing at all. Imagine a Roman column on a British path in October. The cloaks are dark with rain, the hobnails ring on chalk. The men are not speaking much. Their breath clouds in the cold air, and the trees on either side of the path drip steadily, and somewhere ahead a scout has stopped to listen. This is not the Britain of the histories. This is the Britain of the marches between them. Imagine, too, the sight of Maiden Castle from the plain below on the morning of the assault. Its layered ramparts pale in the early light. A herald sent up the slope to demand surrender, small against the height of the earthworks, his voice thinned by the wind. And then, later, the sacred groves of Mona burning at night, the smoke rising into a low sky, and the sound of legionaries moving among the trees, and the older sound, harder to name, of something ending that had been in the landscape for a very long time. The historian Tacitus, writing a generation later, would try to describe some of this. He was, among Roman writers, the one who most often admitted uncertainty, the one who left a little room for the possibility that his own side had not understood everything it had walked into. Others were less careful. Some wrote as if the island had been empty before Rome arrived to fill it in, and as if the peoples they had conquered had been waiting patiently to be given a name and a road. And when the fighting eventually settled, and Roman towns began to rise on Roman roads over the older country, the Romans did something they had done in every province of their empire. They wrote about it. They tried to describe it. They set down its rivers and its harbors, and its tribes in careful Latin sentences. And they gave those tribes borders on maps, and they gave the gods of those tribes Roman names where they could. And in the descriptions, quietly, without ever quite meaning to, they left much out. This is the last of our long chapters, and it is about words, Roman words about Britain and the shape of the silences in between them. This is where the question of what the Romans saw becomes hardest to answer, because we have their sentences, and we have the places their sentences describe, and the two do not quite line up. Roman writing about Britain is scattered across many authors, and none of them wrote a single settled book about the island. Julius Caesar left his commentaries on the Gallic War with 2 chapters describing his brief crossings. Strabo, the Greek geographer, folded Britain into his larger survey of the known world. Pliny the Elder gathered notes on it in his vast encyclopedia of natural history. Tacitus returned to it more than once, in the biography of his father-in-law Agricola, and in the wider sweep of his annals. Cassius Dio, writing later, in Greek, from a distance of a century and more, added his own account of the invasions and the revolts. Their tone is remarkably consistent. The Britons are described as barbarians. Their houses are small and round and made of wood. Their weather is bad, always bad, cold and wet and grey. Their fighting is fierce, but disorganized, brave in the first charge and less patient in the long, grinding work of a set battle. Their religion is uncanny. Their women, and this is a persistent note in the Roman sources, fight alongside their men, and speak in the councils of their tribes, which Roman writers found simultaneously shocking and, in some quiet way, admirable. The word barbarian, in Latin, does not quite mean what the modern English word has come to mean. It means, roughly, someone who does not speak Latin or Greek. Someone whose speech, to a Roman ear, sounded like a repeated syllable, bar bar bar, the noise of a language one has not learned. It carries condescension, certainly, but it does not always carry contempt. A barbarian, to a Roman, could still be brave, still be honorable, still be worth writing about at length. What the barbarian could not be, in Roman eyes, was fully civilized, because civilization was a thing measured in stone cities, and written laws, and forums and bards. And it is here, in that measurement, that the great silence of the Roman record opens up. What the Roman sources rarely acknowledge is the sheer age of what they were walking through. Caesar does not mention Stonehenge. Neither does Tacitus. Silbury Hill goes entirely unrecorded. Avebury is not named in any surviving Roman text. The great henges and mounds and long barrows of Neolithic Britain, which had already been standing on the chalk for 2,000 or 3,000 years by the time the first Roman boots pressed into a British beach, are almost entirely absent from Roman writing about the island. Perhaps the writers did not see them. Perhaps their informants, the soldiers and traders and provincial officials who sent reports back to Rome, did not think such things worth reporting. Perhaps, having no word for what these monuments were, and no framework for a people who could raise a stone ring or a chalk mountain, without a temple around it, and without a written law to justify it, the Romans simply looked past them. They saw a hill, and moved on. They saw a circle of stones in a field, and made no note. The country they described was the country they had categories for, and the older country, the deeper country, quietly slipped between the lines of their prose. What the Romans did record, and in some detail, was the resistance. Caratacus, the British king who fought the invasion for years, moving west and then north into the hills, gathering allies among the tribes, until at last he was defeated and betrayed and taken in chains to Rome, where by all accounts he spoke with such dignity before the Emperor Claudius that his life was spared. Boudica, queen of the Iceni, who led a great revolt in the year 60 or 60, one of the Common Era, and burned the Roman towns of Camulodunum and Londinium and Verulamium, before her armies were finally broken on a field whose exact location we no longer know. The Roman writers found her formidable. Tacitus gave her a speech in his own polished Latin that has been read and reread for 2,000 years, though the words in it are almost certainly his, and not hers. What the Romans also recorded, briefly and uneasily, were the Druids. And here their tone changes. They are not merely dismissive. They are, at moments, afraid. They describe rites in sacred groves, and the offerings left in dark pools, and a class of teachers and judges whose authority did not depend on any Roman ratification. They wrote of these things with a small tightness in the language, as though the writer were glancing over his shoulder while he worked. Some have suggested that this unease was less about what the Druids were actually doing in the first century, and more about what they represented. A class of people who claimed to preserve, in unwritten form, a wisdom older than Rome itself, a memory carried in voice and ceremony, not in scrolls or stone. And every conqueror, the suggestion goes, is a little uneasy in the presence of a memory that does not depend on their language, that cannot be edited by their scribes, that cannot be filed away in their archives. Whether this is right, we cannot know. It is a possibility worth holding softly at the edge of the story, and no more than that. Picture, then, a Roman scribe in a small warm room in Camulodunum on a wet afternoon. The shutters are half closed against the rain. There is a brazier in the corner and the smell of oil and ink. He dips a reed pen into the ink and writes, at the top of a wax tablet, the word Britannia, and then he pauses, because he is not entirely sure what to write next. He has notes from a centurion about a tribe to the north. He has a merchant's list of British exports, tin and hides and hunting dogs. He has a rumour about a stone circle inland that no one can quite explain. He decides not to include the stone circle. It does not fit the shape of the report. Picture, decades later, Tacitus, at his own desk in a comfortable house in Rome, reading a governor's dispatch about a distant island and setting down his careful sentences. He is a fair man by the standards of his profession. He writes that of the original inhabitants of Britain little is known, and he leaves that admission in the text, unpolished, where a lesser historian might have covered it with invention. He is the writer, among all of them, who most often lets uncertainty stand. But even he does not name the mounds. Even he does not describe the avenues of stone. Picture, finally, the corner of a Roman map of Britain, as it might have looked on a wall in a governor's office. The coastline is drawn schematic and tapering, half imagined at its northern reaches. The great inland regions filled in not with the names of places, but with the names of tribes. The Iceni here, the Brigantes there, the Silures in the west. The map is a Roman map, made for Roman purposes, and it tells you where the tax will come from and where the trouble might come from. And it does not tell you where the old country is, because the old country was never what the map was for. And this is what a listener slowly begins to notice, walking through the Roman record of Britain. That the account is careful, and often intelligent, and sometimes even self-aware, and that it is nonetheless the account of an empire looking at a country and seeing quite naturally the things an empire is trained to see. Roads and harbors and tribes and revenues and threats, not the mound in the field, not the circle on the down, not the long, quiet patience of a landscape that had been holding those shapes for a very long time. The bronze trade of an earlier age, the Iron Age forges, the war chariots that had unnerved Caesar, and the men who had come after him under Claudius. All of these fitted more easily into Roman categories, because they were things Romans themselves also did. It was the older layer, the deeper layer, that they could not quite bring into focus. And so, at the end of this long walk through the layered story of the island, we come back to where we began, to that column of soldiers on a British path, in the mist, at dawn, and to what they might have felt if they had let themselves feel it, which is the deepest thing this story has to give us. And it is where we will spend the last calm stretch of the night. There is a small piece of arithmetic that people who love British prehistory sometimes do, quietly, to themselves. It is not a difficult sum. It uses only round numbers, and the kind of counting a child could manage on their fingers if they had patience enough. But it changes, once you have done it, how you feel about a country. It changes the weight of the ground under your feet, when you next walk across a chalk down in the south of England, or past a low green hill in Wiltshire that is not quite the shape a hill should be. And it is worth, in this last calm stretch of the night, doing the sum slowly, together. Stonehenge, in the form we now recognize, was largely finished by around the year 2000, before the Common Era. The full Roman invasion of Britain, the one led under Claudius, began in the year 43 of the Common Era. That is a gap of just over 2,000 years. And we ourselves, sitting where we sit, are also just over 2,000 years away from that Roman invasion. Which means, if you turn the sum around gently in your hand, that Stonehenge was, to a Roman soldier walking past it in the year 60 of the Common Era, more or less as old as that Roman soldier now is to us. Silbury Hill, raised around the year 2400 before the Common Era, was older still. To a Roman standing in the Kennet Valley in the 1st century, Silbury was already about 2,500 years old. Older, in other words, than the pyramids at Giza are to a modern tourist stepping off a coach in the desert with a bottle of water in their hand. This is the piece of arithmetic. It is very simple. It sits quietly in the mind. And once you have done it, the shape of the whole story shifts, because you realize that the Roman column in the mist was not walking into an old country. It was walking into a country whose oldest works were already unimaginably ancient to the men who lived there. Some have suggested, and this is the quietest and deepest speculation we will offer tonight, that when the Romans looked at Britain, they were not, in the fullest sense, looking at the Iron Age Britons at all. Not fundamentally. They were looking, half-consciously, past them, at the mounds in the fields, at the stones on the downs, at the shape of a landscape that had been sculpted, patiently, by human hands for thousands of years before the city of Rome was founded, before the she-wolf and the twins, before the first Latin word was ever written down. The Britons the Romans met were, in a real and rather moving sense, the inheritors of that landscape, not its makers. The people who had raised Stonehenge and Silbury and Avebury were, by the 1st century, mostly a genetic memory, long displaced by the bell-beaker turning that had swept the island around 2500 before the Common Era, and then layered over by later Bronze Age and Iron Age arrivals. No living Briton in the year 60 could have told a Roman officer, with any real confidence, who had built the great mound in the Kennet Valley, or why. The knowledge, if it had ever been passed down in unbroken form, was gone. There were only stories, probably, half remembered and half invented, and the stones themselves still standing where they had been placed. And this, perhaps, is what quietly unsettled the Romans. Not the war chariots, though the chariots unsettled them. Not the weather, not the mist, but the fact that they were walking in a country whose oldest architects had already been forgotten by the country's own people, to an empire that measured its age in a few careful centuries, and that dated its history from the founding of the city in a specific year, a schoolboy could recite aloud. This must have felt strange in a way that was hard to put into words. Britain did not date itself. Britain had no calendar. Britain had, in effect, no memory of its own beginnings. It had only its hills, which were sometimes not hills at all, and its stones, which sometimes stood in circles for reasons no one now could explain, and its druids, the priestly figures of the sacred groves, and the still water, who claimed to remember something old, and who would not, under any pressure, say what. Picture, then, the composite druid one more time, softly. A figure on the earthen rampart of a hill fort at dawn, wrapped against the cold, looking down into a valley where a Roman column is moving along a track. The druid says nothing. Whatever they know, or think they know, about the mound in the next valley, or the stones on the ridge above, they keep to themselves. Tacitus, the historian who admitted uncertainty, would not have been told. No Roman would have been told. And picture, alongside them, that other quiet figure we have imagined before, the Neolithic engineer, the one who 5,000 years ago, on some rise of chalk in what is now Wiltshire, said, "Here, on this spot, this is where the mound will begin," whose name never entered any story, whose voice was never written down, whose work still stands, unlabeled, in the fields. Consider, gently a Roman patrol at first light, moving along a valley track while Silbury Hill rises out of the mist, to their left, a green shoulder in the pale air. The soldiers glance up, one of them, perhaps, wonders for a moment what it is. And then he looks back at the road, because he has somewhere to be, and orders to keep, and boots to keep dry, and the mound recedes behind them, unremarked, unmeasured, unrecorded, as it had already stood, unremarked in the same way, through more centuries than his empire had years. Or consider a Roman surveyor, further south, laying out the line of a new road across the chalk, with his instruments and his cords and his patient assistants. He sights along his line. He adjusts. He sights again. And then he notices that the line he has drawn runs directly through the low, deliberate curve of a barrow he had not, at first, seen against the shape of the hill. He does not write about this in his report. He simply adjusts the line, quietly, and moves the road a little to the north, and the barrow keeps its silence, and the work goes on. Or step, in the mind, into the interior of the West Kennet Long Barrow at midday. The stone passage is cool and dry. Your breath sounds close and slightly damp. There is a faint smell of chalk and old earth, and the awareness, if you allow yourself to sit with it, that this small chambered room was already ancient when the first Roman was born, that it had been standing when the pharaohs were still being buried, that the hands which shaped its stones belonged to people whose language no one now can even guess at, and whose faces no portrait ever caught. We do not know, in the end, what the Romans really thought when they walked among these things. They did not write it down, not clearly, not in a way that has survived to us. Perhaps most of them, most of the time, thought very little. Perhaps they were cold and tired and thinking about supper and the state of their boots and whether the next posting would be somewhere warmer. Perhaps only a few, at certain moments, on certain mornings, in certain valleys, felt the strange, cool feeling of walking through a country older than their own, words for old. We may never know. That is one of the questions Britain simply keeps, and perhaps that is the right shape for this story to have. A story with its center gently missing, like the mound with no burial chamber found within it, like the great circles with no inscription carved into their stones, like the sacred pools that held their weapons and their offerings, and gave no explanation for either. Like the island itself, which keeps its oldest secrets not by hiding them, but simply by being still, exactly where it has always been. The hills where the hills were. The stones where the stones were. The long, quiet patience of a landscape that outlasted the empire that once tried so carefully to draw it on a map. So, that is more or less the story, or a small part of the story. Because the story of a country is never really finished, and this one particularly has a way of stretching further and further back the more you look. Pull the picture back now, gently, as far as it will go. The Roman column in the mist, the stepped mound rising against the pale sky, the stones in their long, patient circles, all of it, far away now, on the other side of 2,000 years, and further still. The Romans came and stayed for 4 centuries, and left. The Britons they met, and their languages, and their gods, changed and changed again. Saxons came, and Vikings, and Normans, and all the quiet layers we now call English. And still the mounds sat where they sat, and still the stones stood in their circles, and still the water in certain pools held, deep down, the memory of a sword slid gently in, one very quiet morning long ago. All of it is a long way from your warm bed and your quiet room. All of it is finished. All of it is safe now, folded into the past, where nothing can hurt anyone anymore. You do not have to remember any of the names. You do not have to hold on to any of the dates. The people who built Silbury Hill did not know their own names would be forgotten. They built it anyway, and it is still there. Tacitus admitted he did not know who the first Britons were, and he was a professional. If it was little known to him, it can be gently unknown to you tonight, and that is entirely all right. There is no need to keep watching the screen. You can close your eyes. Sleep is not failure here. Sleep is the point you can let the whole long story slide, softly, out of your mind. The Romans, the Druids, the stones, the mound, the soldiers in the mist, all of it can go. It will be here again in the morning, or the next night, or whenever you want it. It is not going anywhere. You can rest. Nothing here needs anything from you. The story keeps itself. The Romans came and went. The Britons, they met, came and went. The people who raised the great mounds and the great stones came and went, longer ago than most of us can quite hold in the head at once. And like everything in this story, the stones are still standing. The mound is still there. The mist still gathers, at dawn, in the same low valleys, and we are still, in our small, quiet way, listening. Good night, from wherever this finds you.